Harlem evenings often settled into themselves quietly, with stoops filling and storefront lights warming the pavement. That night felt ordinary enough. A boy walked a familiar block, small steps echoing confidence borrowed from routine. He carried nothing dangerous, only the comfort of belonging. That was what made the moment so sharp when strangers decided he didn't. Their words were careless, their hands worse, and their intent unmistakable. It wasn't an attack meant to end a life, it was meant to place one. No one screamed, no sirens followed. The gang laughed, satisfied that the message had been delivered without consequence. They believed borders were fixed, that Harlem's strength stopped where their comfort ended. They believed history had already decided who could be touched and who could not. The boy stood stunned, more confused than hurt, absorbing something heavier than pain. Shame tries to teach lessons quickly. Racism teaches them early. News travels differently when children are involved. It doesn't rush. It spreads through tightened voices and shortened sentences. Neighbors noticed a shift before they heard the story. Mothers paused longer at windows. Men stopped mid-conversation. Something had been crossed that didn't require explanation. This wasn't about territory or profit. It was about inheritance. Bumpy Johnson heard without theatrics. No table was struck. No order barked. The room around him felt smaller, not with anger, but with focus. He understood the meaning instantly. An insult to a child was never just personal. It was a test directed at the future. Those who touched his son were saying tomorrow could be handled the same way yesterday always had. Harlem felt that weight settle across blocks. Store owners shared looks instead of opinions. Pastors closed meetings early. Musicians packed up before the last song. No one asked what should be done. They asked who had been reminded of what. The answer came quietly. Everyone. The gang expected fear or noise. They got neither. What followed was coordination without meetings, agreement without speeches. The city began adjusting itself, inch by inch. Routes changed. Doors closed earlier. Eyes stayed open longer. This was not revenge warming up. It was correction preparing itself. People remembered other nights when boundaries were tested loudly. Those nights ended with blood and headlines. This one felt different. It carried restraint like a held breath. Harlem understood that reacting the way outsiders expected would only confirm the insult. The answer had to be larger than anger and cleaner than force. For the boy, the street felt altered. Familiar corners held new meaning. Adults spoke softer around him, careful not to make the lesson heavier. Protection wrapped itself around his routine without suffocating it. The city was teaching him something else now, that harm could be answered without becoming it. Racism had misjudged where power lived. It assumed power needed permission or uniforms. It mistook quiet for absence. Harlem knew better. Power lived in memory, in shared refusal, in the ability to change behavior overnight without a single command. By the time the sun rose, the story had already outgrown the moment. It was no longer about one boy or one gang. It was about whether a city would accept being reminded of limits it had outgrown. The answer was forming without announcement. This touch did not spark chaos. It sparked alignment. Harlem prepared to respond in a way that would be unmistakable and irreversible, not with violence, but with unity sharp enough to redraw lines. The city had heard the message. Now it was choosing how to answer. What followed would surprise outsiders, unsettle racists, and teach a generation that belonging, once defended together, can reorganize streets, habits, and futures faster than fear ever could when a city chooses unity over rage and remembers its children. Bumpy Johnson lived surrounded by violence, but he refused to let it define his home. Harlem knew his name through whispers and headlines, yet his children knew a different man entirely. Inside his walls, there were rules stricter than any street code. No guns, no meetings, no raised voices carrying the weight of business. He believed danger was learned quickly enough without being taught. Childhood, once lost, could never be returned. His son was raised to move through the neighborhood without armor. Not as bait, not as symbol, as a child who deserved sidewalks instead of strategies. Bumpy insisted on ordinary things: school mornings, clean shirts, evenings that ended before the streets hardened. He understood power well enough to know it could not protect innocence once it was exposed. So he hid it in plain sight. Men around him found this confusing. Some mistook it for weakness. Others recognized it as discipline. Bumpy drew lines that did not bend. Business ended at the door. Family never crossed into the ledger. He believed children were not extensions of a man's reputation. They were the proof of whether that reputation mattered at all. His son did not know the machinery that turned beneath Harlem. He knew names of shopkeepers, not lieutenants. He knew music drifting from windows, not coded warnings. That separation was intentional. Bumpy wanted him to grow without measuring rooms or reading threats in silence. He wanted him to inherit possibility, not consequence. That was why the incident landed so heavily. The act was not simply racist hostility spilling into a child's path. It was an intrusion into something deliberately protected. Those who touched him did not challenge a gangster. They violated an agreement the entire neighborhood understood. Children were not collateral. They were sacred. Harlem had watched Bumpy enforce boundaries for years, but this boundary was different. It was shared. Parents recognized it immediately. They knew what it meant to raise children in a place that demanded constant vigilance. They also knew how rare it was for someone like Bumpy to insist on normalcy for his family. That insistence earned quiet respect. The attack reframed itself in the community's mind. It was no longer about one family's pain. It was about the future being tested. If a child could be handled that way, then no amount of success or power meant safety. That idea was unacceptable. Bumpy did not rage publicly because rage would have centered him. He understood this was larger. His restraint allowed the focus to remain where it belonged, on the violation, on the principle, on the line that could not be crossed without reshaping the city's response. His son returned home confused, shielded from the deeper implications, but surrounded by care. Adults adjusted without explanation. Routes changed. Watchfulness increased. The neighborhood closed ranks in a way that felt maternal rather than militant. Protection does not always arrive with threats. Sometimes it arrives with presence. This was the environment Bumpy had wanted for his children all along, a place where safety was communal, not transactional, where innocence was guarded by many, not enforced by one. The incident clarified why that mattered. By understanding how carefully Bumpy separated his family from his power, the response began to make sense. Harlem was not preparing revenge. It was restoring balance. The insult had reached into something universal. Parents did not need instruction to respond to that. The city was about to answer not as an underworld, but as a community. What followed would not look like crime. It would look like alignment. And it would make clear that while power could rule streets, only shared values could protect children. That understanding spread quietly overnight, changing habits, boundaries, and expectations without speeches or visible force. The gang did not arrive with banners or plans. They moved through the edges of the city the way they always had, relying on habit more than strategy. Segregation had trained them to believe streets carried borders that could not be crossed. They assumed Harlem ended where their comfort began. Familiar routes bred confidence, and confidence hardened into carelessness. They were not powerful, they were loud, in small numbers, and invisible in crowds. Their reputation existed only among themselves, inflated by stories repeated until they sounded true. They mistook the absence of immediate resistance for permission. In their minds, the city was a map with safe zones, and they believed they knew where those zones lay. That belief shaped everything. They learned which corners felt quiet, which faces looked away, which moments passed without consequence. Over time, the routine dulled their caution. Hatred alone did not push them forward. Routine did. Routine whispered that nothing would happen, that nothing ever did. They misread Harlem because they misunderstood power. They thought power was uniform, fixed, and visible. They believed influence traveled openly, marked by uniforms or names. What they failed to see was how influence in Harlem moved through memory and mutual obligation. It did not announce itself. It responded. The act itself was brief, careless, and thoughtless. To them it felt small, almost forgettable. They believed the moment would dissolve the way so many others had. No sirens, no chase, no confrontation. That silence reassured them. Silence always had, but this time silence meant something else. It meant information spreading without sound. It meant people noticing details the gang never considered: faces, names, directions taken. The city watched even when it did not look like it was watching. They assumed division protected them. That belief was their undoing. Harlem was not isolated by lines on a map. It was connected by experience. When a child was touched, the insult crossed every border at once. Parents understood immediately. Elders understood without discussion. The response did not require coordination because the principle was shared. The gang had never encountered that kind of unity. Their world was fractured by design. Fear worked there because isolation made it effective. In Harlem, isolation dissolved quickly. Word traveled through kitchens, barbershops, and stoops, not as outrage, but as recognition. The city knew exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. Arrogance kept the gang unaware. They went on with their routines, convinced the night had ended. They did not sense the recalibration around them. Stores closed earlier. Streets grew quieter. Eyes lingered longer. None of it looked like danger to men who expected danger to be loud. Their mistake was not ideology alone. It was underestimation. They underestimated how seriously Harlem guarded its children. They underestimated how quickly a community could align without orders. Most of all, they underestimated how power responded when it was challenged through innocence rather than territory. By morning, their confidence had nothing to stand on. The city they thought they understood had shifted. Familiar routes felt unfamiliar. Doors closed, voices cooled. The same silence that once protected them now followed them like a shadow. Recklessness rarely announces its consequences. It reveals them later, in the way paths disappear and safety evaporates. The gang had mistaken routine for control and division for protection. The city corrected that misunderstanding without spectacle. What doomed them was not retaliation yet, but realization. Harlem had noticed. Harlem had agreed. And once agreement formed, the outcome no longer depended on the gang at all. It depended on a city preparing to answer in its own way, quietly and completely. That preparation marked the moment inevitability replaced surprise, and the city's response moved from awareness toward action, patient, collective, and unstoppable everywhere. Harlem did not file complaints. It did not wait for courtrooms or cameras. The response arrived through routine, subtle, and immediate, carried by choices made without meetings or slogans. Shop doors stayed open later. Tables filled with faces once turned away. Music spilled from rooms that had quietly changed their rules overnight. No announcement marked the shift. It was understood. People adjusted first, institutions followed. Restaurant owners watched who sat where and realized resistance cost more than inclusion. Bartenders learned that refusing service meant empty stools by the next night. Doormen recognized that enforcing old lines invited new problems they could not solve. The city applied pressure the way it always had, through participation. Integration did not arrive as an argument. It arrived as presence. Harlem residents crossed thresholds together, calmly, repeatedly, until denial became impractical. There were no speeches explaining why. Explanation was unnecessary. Behavior taught faster than words ever could. What made it powerful was its ordinariness. Families ate, couples danced, friends gathered. Each normal act carried weight because it was deliberate. Business owners understood the message without anyone delivering it. Serve everyone or serve no one. The choice belonged to them, but the outcome was shared. Law enforcement remained peripheral. There were no incidents demanding intervention, no crowds to disperse. Everything looked peaceful, which confused outsiders expecting confrontation. This was not protest seeking attention. It was correction seeking permanence. The city moved as one body without central direction. Churches welcomed new faces without ceremony. Corner stores stopped watching certain customers more closely than others. Seating arrangements dissolved quietly. The absence of conflict became the signal that something fundamental had shifted. Pressure worked because it was consistent. A single night could be dismissed. Repetition could not. Every evening reinforced the same reality. Integration was happening because people were making it happen, not because permission had been granted. Those who resisted found themselves isolated. Suppliers hesitated. Musicians canceled. Patrons chose elsewhere. The cost of holding old boundaries rose steadily, never violently, never dramatically. It simply became unsustainable. Harlem understood leverage instinctively. Money, movement, and reputation mattered more than arguments. By redirecting all three, the neighborhood reshaped behavior across entire blocks. Segregation depended on compliance. Compliance evaporated. The speed of the change unsettled those who benefited from separation. Overnight habits failed. Assumptions collapsed. What had once been enforced by fear now dissolved through familiarity. Seeing people share space removed the illusion of difference that segregation relied on. This was enforcement without enforcers. No one claimed credit. No leader stepped forward. That anonymity protected the movement and strengthened it. Without faces to confront, there was nothing to push back against. The change belonged to everyone and no one. Harlem did not debate morality publicly. It practiced it. By acting first, it removed the need for justification. The city demonstrated that integration was not radical. It was practical. It stabilized business, reduced tension, and restored dignity without spectacle. Outsiders struggled to name what was happening. It did not fit their frameworks. There were no demands to negotiate, no threats to address. Only a city behaving differently and expecting the same from anyone operating within it. This quiet insistence revealed something deeper. Power did not always confront injustice head-on. Sometimes it made injustice impossible to maintain. By changing daily patterns, Harlem eliminated the space where segregation could survive. By the time anyone thought to object, the objection felt outdated. The city had already moved forward. Normal had been redefined. The transition was complete because it had been lived, not argued. What followed next was inevitable. Attention turned toward the man many believed stood behind the shift, even though he had remained unseen. The question was no longer whether Harlem had changed, but how that change traced back to a single line that had been crossed. Bumpy Johnson never stepped to a microphone. He never called a meeting, never summoned lieutenants, never let a message leak with his name attached. There were no public demands, no warnings delivered through intermediaries, no performances meant to signal outrage. From the outside, it looked like he had done nothing at all. That absence confused people who believed power only existed when it announced itself. Inside Harlem, the message was unmistakable. Bumpy understood something fundamental about authority. Orders invite resistance. Silence invites interpretation. And interpretation, when shaped by reputation, travels farther than any command ever could. People moved not because they were told to, but because they knew what the moment required. His restraint created space for the city to act on its own conscience. Harlem had learned how to read him over years of observation. They knew when he was angry. They knew when he was calculating. And they knew that when he said nothing after a line had been crossed, it meant the response would not be simple or small. Silence, in this case, was not uncertainty. It was confidence. That confidence carried weight. Shop owners adjusted policies without being approached. Club managers reconsidered rules without receiving calls. Businessmen sensed that maintaining the old order was suddenly riskier than changing it. No one could point to a directive, yet everyone felt the pressure. Bumpy's influence operated like gravity, invisible, constant, impossible to ignore. What made it powerful was its restraint. He did not exploit the moment to expand control or settle unrelated scores. He allowed the issue to remain focused. This was not about territory or profit. It was about dignity. By refusing to frame it as a confrontation, he removed opportunities for escalation. Harlem could act without fear of triggering something larger. People often mistake loud reactions for strength. Bumpy knew better. Loudness narrows options. Silence keeps them open. His refusal to announce anything allowed each individual, each business, each institution to arrive at the same conclusion independently. That shared realization bonded them more tightly than orders ever could. The city understood that this wasn't rage spilling outward. It was principle holding firm. And principle, once demonstrated, does not need repetition. Bumpy trusted Harlem to enforce its own standards because he had spent years building mutual respect. This was the return on that investment. Even those outside Harlem noticed the shift. They waited for statements that never came. They listened for threats that were never voiced. The absence unsettled them more than anger would have. It suggested certainty. It suggested that whatever response was coming did not require coordination or explanation. Bumpy's reputation filled the silence completely. People remembered previous moments when patience preceded consequence. They remembered how outcomes arrived quietly, fully formed, leaving no room for negotiation afterward. That memory guided behavior now. No one wanted to misread the moment by demanding clarity that did not belong to them. This was authority functioning at its highest level. It did not chase compliance. It assumed it. Harlem responded because it recognized itself in the situation. The city acted not to please Bumpy, but to preserve its own sense of order. His silence allowed that distinction to exist. In doing nothing publicly, Bumpy allowed everything to happen privately. The city reorganized itself around a shared understanding faster and more thoroughly than any speech could have achieved. The absence of his voice made room for collective action, and that made the change durable. What followed next did not require his involvement either. Once the city had moved, consequences naturally flowed toward those who had misjudged it. Bumpy did not need to direct that outcome. He had already shaped the conditions that made it inevitable. The quiet was not empty. It was full of meaning. And as Harlem continued to adjust, the focus began to shift away from the city's response and toward the source of the offense. The question was no longer how Harlem had changed so quickly, but what would happen to the ones who had forced it to. The gang did not vanish in a single night. There were no sirens, no raids, no public reckoning that satisfied curiosity. Instead, their presence thinned quietly, like smoke losing shape once a window is opened. Familiar faces stopped appearing on corners where they once lingered. The confidence that had carried them through certain streets drained away without confrontation. Businesses were the first to move, not because they were told to, but because associations suddenly felt dangerous. Doors that once opened easily began staying closed. Bar owners declined service without explanation. Mechanics claimed they were too busy. Landlords hesitated to renew leases. None of it came with threats. It came with distance. Neighborhoods followed. Harlem had always known how to close ranks without drawing attention. Sidewalk conversations ended when the wrong people approached. Eyes turned away, shoulders stiffened. The subtle cues that signal belonging disappeared. Without allies or familiarity, territory becomes hostile even when no words are exchanged. The gang noticed quickly. Power relies on access, and access evaporated. Places that once tolerated them now treated them like strangers. They could still walk the streets, but the streets no longer welcomed them. Every step required calculation. Every glance carried judgment. They were not hunted. They were excluded. This form of consequence carried its own cruelty. Violence creates martyrs and stories. Displacement creates silence. There was nothing to rally around, nothing to retaliate against, no clear enemy to confront. Just an environment that no longer supported their presence. They tried to adapt. Some attempted apologies that went unanswered. Others sought refuge in areas where their reputations still held weight, only to find those spaces shrinking as well. Influence does not travel far when it is built on intimidation rather than trust. Without territory, identity erodes. Harlem reclaimed itself without celebration. Businesses thrived under new patterns. Customers moved freely where they once hesitated. The city did not announce victory because there was none to announce. Order had simply been restored. The absence of conflict was the proof. Law enforcement barely noticed. There were no spikes in crime, no visible disruptions that demanded attention. From the outside, it looked like nothing had happened. Inside the community, everything had changed. That contrast was intentional. The most effective corrections leave no evidence. The gang members understood eventually that the loss was permanent, not because someone told them so, but because nothing they tried reversed it. Influence, once withdrawn, rarely returns. Territory, once surrendered by behavior, is not reclaimed by force. Some drifted away quietly, seeking anonymity elsewhere. Others stayed too long, hoping familiarity would soften resistance. It didn't. The city had already decided. Harlem had no interest in prolonging the lesson. This was not vengeance, it was maintenance. A boundary had been crossed, and the response restored balance without spectacle. The punishment fit the offense precisely. Access was removed, relevance dissolved, oxygen disappeared. What made it devastating was its completeness. There was no dramatic ending to point at, no story to twist into grievance, just a slow realization that the city no longer made room for them. Power had shifted, and they were not part of it. In crime documentaries, consequences are often loud. Here they were quiet and absolute. The audience is left with an unsettling truth. Loss of territory can erase a threat more effectively than any confrontation. As the gang faded, Harlem did not look back. The space they occupied filled naturally with new routines, new faces, new confidence. The city moved forward without interruption. And in that movement, the lesson settled. Access is fragile. Respect is communal. When a city withdraws recognition, there is nowhere left to stand. The territory was not taken by force. It was simply reclaimed, leaving only absence behind and silence where arrogance once stood forever. Fear did not remake Harlem. No threat announced this change. No warning preceded it. What shifted behavior was presence, steady and undeniable. People began sharing space not because they were afraid of punishment, but because exclusion no longer worked. Reality applied pressure where intimidation never could. Integration arrived without speeches. It came through routine. A man sat where he once avoided. A family ate where they had been unwelcome. A business owner realized resistance cost more than cooperation. These moments accumulated quietly, reshaping habits faster than laws ever managed. Power expressed itself through normalization, not force. Harlem demonstrated something older than policy. Coexistence does not require agreement, it requires consequence. When access becomes conditional, behavior adapts. The city did not demand unity. It made division impractical. That distinction mattered. Fear burns hot and brief. Presence settles in and stays. Those watching from outside misunderstood the shift. They looked for rallies or crackdowns and found none. What they missed was the collective decision unfolding in daily choices. People moved differently. Doors opened wider. Spaces overlapped, not out of idealism, but clarity. The cost of separation had become visible. This was not kindness replacing hostility. It was structure replacing chaos. When Harlem integrated, it did so by removing the benefits of segregation. Businesses that adapted thrived. Those that resisted stalled. Customers followed momentum, not ideology. Survival shaped values more effectively than argument. The absence of violence confused observers who believed fear was the primary engine of change. But fear had always existed, and nothing shifted. What changed was proximity. When people shared rooms, sidewalks, and routines, difference lost its leverage. Separation depends on distance. Presence dissolves it. Influence moved faster than legislation because it operated where people lived. Laws require enforcement. Culture requires acceptance. Harlem enforced coexistence by making it the default. Once established, it required no maintenance. People adjusted because life functioned better that way. Bumpy Johnson's role remained indirect, almost invisible. He did not champion integration publicly. He did not negotiate terms. His influence worked because it was understood. The city trusted that certain lines mattered, and once crossed, correction followed. That trust allowed people to act without waiting for permission. Strategic thinkers recognize this pattern. Systems change when incentives shift. Harlem shifted incentives. Belonging became accessible. Exclusion became expensive. The result was stability, not celebration. Order arrived quietly because it had been invited by circumstance. This reframing challenges common narratives. Progress did not arrive through moral awakening or fear of retribution. It arrived through lived consequence. People learned quickly what behavior sustained access and what behavior isolated them. The lesson required no explanation. As coexistence settled in, tension eased, not because differences vanished, but because conflict lost utility. When people depend on shared spaces, escalation becomes self-defeating. Harlem understood this intuitively. Integration was not an ideal, it was a solution. The city's response revealed a deeper truth about power. It does not need to dominate to direct. It needs to be consistent. Harlem's consistency made segregation obsolete. Not illegal, just irrelevant. Observers expected backlash. None came. The absence of resistance was itself a signal. Those who might have opposed the change recognized the cost. Interference would have meant isolation. Silence was strategic. Fear failed because it always does, eventually. It exhausts itself. Presence worked because it persisted. It reshaped norms by making alternatives impractical. This was not social engineering, it was adaptation. By the time the shift was noticeable, it was already complete. Harlem had integrated not through decree, but through daily agreement enforced by reality. The lesson lingered quietly, preparing the ground for understanding rather than confrontation. What remained was a city functioning differently without needing to explain why. That quiet transformation set the stage for reflection, allowing the story to close, not with triumph, but with meaning carried forward naturally. Years later, the story still circulated, not as rumor, but as guidance. People didn't recount it to impress outsiders or inflate legends. They told it softly, in kitchens and barbershops, when conversations drifted toward limits and respect. The details shifted with time, but the meaning stayed fixed. Children were never part of the game. Once that line was crossed, everything else changed. Harlem remembered because it had felt the moment collectively. The city had moved together, not in panic or celebration, but in agreement. Integration held not because it was forced, but because it proved itself workable. People learned that coexistence wasn't a slogan. It was a structure sustained by consequence and awareness. Bumpy Johnson's name lingered differently after that. He wasn't spoken of as a gangster first. He became a reference for restraint, a man who understood that power revealed itself most clearly when it refused to perform. His influence reshaped behavior without demanding recognition. That subtlety gave it longevity. Older residents noticed the difference as years passed. Clubs changed hands. Streets evolved. New faces arrived without knowing the origin of the rule they followed. Yet the boundary held. Families moved through spaces once denied them. Businesses adjusted instinctively. No one announced the change anymore. It had become normal. The racist gang faded completely from memory. Their names dissolved, unworthy of repetition. What replaced them was not fear, but irrelevance. They had misunderstood where authority lived and paid the price through exclusion. Harlem did not need to punish them again. The city simply outgrew them. This endurance mattered more than any single act. Many moments burn bright and disappear. This one settled. It became part of Harlem's internal compass, guiding behavior without requiring reminders. The lesson did not shout. It waited, confident it would be understood by those who mattered. Bumpy never claimed credit. He never corrected the narrative or shaped it publicly. That absence preserved the lesson's purity. It wasn't about loyalty to a man. It was about respect for a principle. Children were untouchable. Racism carried consequence. Community mattered. Younger generations learned the rule without hearing the story. They absorbed it through observation, through where people sat, through who was welcomed, through which jokes stopped mid-sentence. That was the real measure of change. When rules no longer needed explanation, they had taken root. Historians often search for speeches or laws to mark transformation. Harlem offered something quieter, a collective adjustment driven by shared understanding. Influence replaced force. Presence replaced fear. The city chose stability over spectacle. This was not redemption or victory. It was balance, a recalibration that allowed life to continue with fewer fractures. People lived longer because lines were clear. Children grew safer because limits were respected. That was the legacy that endured. Bumpy Johnson became inseparable from that boundary, not because he enforced it loudly, but because he allowed others to enforce it correctly. His restraint gave the city room to act with dignity. That choice mattered more than any display of dominance. As time carried Harlem forward, the lesson remained intact. Not frozen in nostalgia, but active in daily life. It shaped tone, movement, and expectation. It reminded people that power does not need applause to be effective. The story ends without resolution because it never needed one. The outcome had already settled into behavior. Harlem remembered not the incident, but the order that followed. That order endured quietly, protecting what mattered most. Some power reshapes history without speeches. Some limits define eras. Harlem never forgot because it never had to be reminded. The boundary lived on, steady and unseen, guiding generations long after the night itself faded from view.